The world was a dizzying, painful blur of white lights and hissing machines. I was in the hospital intensive care unit, my body fighting for life after a sudden, severe allergic reaction to medication. The anaphylaxis had come without warning. My throat closing, my lungs rebelling, my skin erupting in welts that burned like fire. The ER doctors had moved with controlled urgency, needles and oxygen and medication flooding my system until the attack subsided into a painful, exhausted truce. Now, hooked to monitors and 4 lines, I floated in that peculiar space between consciousness and chemical fog, every breath a small negotiation with my own body. The heart monitor beeped with mechanical persistence. In out, steady and persistent. The sound had become the rhythm of my survival. My phone, propped on the bedside tray where a nurse had placed it that morning, vibrated against the plastic surface. Once. Twice. The third vibration knocked it slightly. I forced my eyes to focus through the exhaustion, my vision swimming, then settling. A text from my mother, Victoria Vance. I read the first line and my heart stuttered. The words swam in front of me, each one landing like a physical blow. It's expensive keeping you alive. I've been thinking about the hospital bills, the medications, the years of therapy you'll need. Honestly, darling, the world, and our family's reputation, would be cleaner if you just disappeared. It would solve everything. The heart monitor beside me began to shriek. Beep, beep, beep. My pulse had spiked, climbing into dangerous territory. A nurse rushed in, glancing at the screen, then at me with professional concern. Ilara? Are you in pain? Do you need? I'm fine, I gasped, turning my head away from the phone. Just a nightmare. She adjusted something on my fore, and within moments, a cool wave spread through my arm. The medication pulled me under before I could think, before I could process what those words actually meant. But as my eyes closed, one thought crystallized with terrible clarity. My own mother had just wished me dead. Not in anger. Not in a moment of passion. In measured, deliberate text form, preserved forever in the cloud. My name is Ilara Vance. I am 23 years old, and I have spent my entire life living in the shadow of a woman who should have loved me unconditionally but instead taught me that my existence was an inconvenience. Growing up, I was always the sensitive one. While my older sister Celeste commanded rooms with her blonde hair and confident smile, I retreated into books and whispered words. Celeste was the golden child, the one whose accomplishments were broadcast to family friends, whose boyfriends were paraded through dinner parties, whose very presence seemed to validate my parents' good taste and genetic superiority. I was the other daughter. The anxious one. The one who needed special handling, as my mother would tell other people within earshot of me, as though anxiety were a contagious disease rather than a response to living in a home where love was conditional and criticism was constant. My mother, Victoria Vance, was a beautiful woman in the way that some women are beautiful, with the kind of looks that had been carefully maintained through expensive treatments, the kind of beauty that commanded attention at fundraisers and charity galas. She was also dangerous in ways I didn't fully understand until I was older, in ways that didn't leave bruises but left scars nonetheless. My father, Senator Charles Vance, was the public figure, handsome in that aging politician way, with silver-threaded hair and a smile that had won him 3 terms in the state senate. At home, he was Victoria's shadow, always agreeing with her assessments of my failings, always prioritizing his political reputation over his children's well-being. The house I grew up in was a masterpiece of calculated perfection. Everything in it was expensive and cold. The art on the walls had been chosen by an interior designer. The furniture was arranged to photograph well. And we, Celeste, Charles, Victoria, and I, moved through those rooms like actors who had memorized our parts. I had learned to make myself small. To absorb criticism without response. To interpret my mother's emotional neglect as her way of preparing me for a harsh world. It was a survival mechanism I had perfected by the age of 12, a skill that had become so ingrained in my personality that I no longer recognized it as learned behavior. I was 23 years old and I had never questioned whether my mother should love me. I had only questioned what I had done to deserve her conditional affection. Now, in that hospital bed, I was beginning to wonder if she had ever loved me at all. When I woke, I was alone. The sun had moved across the window, painting the sterile room in shades of late afternoon gold. The machines around me continued their steady rhythm. I was still alive. My body, despite my mother's wishes, had not cooperated with her vision of a cleaner world. My phone was still on the bedside tray. I reached for it with trembling fingers. The screen was dark. I unlocked it and navigated to my messages with the kind of precision that fear provides. The text was still there. I hadn't imagined it. The cruelty of those words was documented, real, undeniable. My mind, which had been foggy moments before, snapped into something sharp and cold. Survival mode. The part of me that had spent 23 years navigating a minefield of conditional love recognized this moment as critical. This was evidence. This was proof. This was the moment everything changed. With shaking fingers, I navigated to my phone's settings. The screen recording feature was there, waiting to be activated. I pressed it, watching as the red recording indicator appeared at the top of my screen. Then, with deliberate care, I navigated back to the message. I let the recording capture the timestamp, the sender's name, every single word of my mother's carefully considered cruelty. The screen recording ran for 2 minutes. I captured not just the initial message, but the time it had been sent, 3:47 a.m., which meant she had woken in the middle of the night specifically to send this to me. She hadn't been angry in the moment. She had thought about it. When I finished, I backed up the recording to a secure cloud account that I had set up years ago, a digital safety deposit box that no one else knew about. Then I deleted the backup from my phone's storage, leaving only the message itself. My mother had given me evidence. My mother had handed me the key to my own freedom, not knowing that she was also constructing her own downfall. I lay back against the pillows and watched the 4 drip, counting the moments until I could learn the truth about why she wanted me gone. Because there had to be a reason beyond the obvious cruelty. Victoria Vance was many things, but she wasn't impulsive. She was calculating. She was strategic. This message, cruel as it was, had to be about something more than just a difficult daughter and hospital bills. I needed to know what I was worth to her dead. They arrived together the next morning, my parents, moving through the hospital room like actors taking the stage. Senator Charles Vance first, with his tailored suit and his professional smile, the smile he used for constituents and photographs. He approached the bed with the kind of practiced concern that I had seen directed at widows and disaster victims during political campaign stops. "Elara, darling, you scared us all," he said, reaching for my hand. I wanted to recoil from his touch, but instead, I had learned to be small. I let him take my hand, let him squeeze it gently, let him play the role of concerned father while my heart hammered against my ribs. My mother followed, her blonde hair arranged in its usual elegant waves, her expression a masterpiece of controlled emotion. She air-kissed Charles's cheek before turning her attention to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We just need you to be strong, sweetie," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was performing concern. "Your illness has created a lot of noise right now. The senator's office has already fielded inquiries from journalists asking about the family's health. It's quite inconvenient." She reached for my hand. I flinched, pulling away slightly, unable to mask the instinctive recoil from her touch. Her eyes flashed with something cold and quick. Anger, maybe, or frustration. She pretended not to notice, smoothing her expression back into something sympathetic, but I had seen it. That flash of true feeling beneath the mask. "We just need you to recover, darling," she continued, her fingers still reaching toward me, still pretending to comfort me. "Then we can all move forward." They stayed for 20 minutes, the 3 of us engaged in a careful dance of performance and concealment. I played the role of the grateful daughter, recovering from trauma, grateful for their presence. They played the role of concerned parents, worried and supportive. It was a play we had all been rehearsing for years. When the nurse came in to adjust my fall, my parents moved away from the bed, standing near the window. I watched them, waiting, and then I made a decision that would change everything. I activated the voice memo app on my phone, keeping it casual, as though I were simply checking my messages. Then I placed the phone carefully on the bedside tray, concealing it behind a tissue box with the camera angle positioned toward the corner where my parents were standing. My heart was racing. If they saw what I was doing, there would be questions I couldn't answer, accusations I couldn't defend against. But my mother had taught me something valuable over the years. Even if she didn't mean to, if you were clever enough, brave enough, and willing to take risks, you could protect yourself. The nurse left the room. My parents' voices dropped into conspiratorial whispers. We need her to stabilize long enough to sign those forms, Victoria, my father said, his voice tight with an emotion I had never heard from him before. Fear, perhaps. Or desperation. Her 24th birthday is only 3 months away. Once the trust matures on her birthday, we lose everything to her. The trust fund. My grandmother's legacy. The one thing my parents had never been able to touch, never been able to control. The one thing that was supposed to be mine. A safety net, a possibility, an escape route from the careful control they had constructed around my life. My mother's reply was icy, calculated, and absolutely merciless. I know, Charles. That's why I've been cultivating her instability very carefully. Dr. Albright has already drafted the commitment recommendation. We claim emotional distress due to the recent trauma and the allergic reaction. We tell the court she's having a complete psychological breakdown. We request that she be placed under psychiatric care, institutionalized, if necessary. The court will appoint us as custodians of the trust fund, declaring her incapable of managing her assets. By the time she's stable enough to fight it, the money will be transferred to your foundation, and the political situation will be handled. Charles exhaled slowly. And if she doesn't go along with it? If she fights back? She won't, Victoria said with absolute certainty. She never does. She's too afraid of me, too conditioned to obey. She's been that way since she was a child. The oxygen tube felt suffocating, but my mind suddenly cleared. It had never been about the hospital bills. It had never been about my anxiety or my perceived instability. It had never been about concern for my well-being or about what was best for me. It had always been about money. My parents had orchestrated my entire life to create the foundation for this moment. The criticism, the neglect, the constant reminders that I was too sensitive, too anxious, too broken. All of it had been carefully constructed to convince me that I was unstable. And more importantly, to create a psychological profile that would be easy for a corrupt psychiatrist to weaponize in court. I wasn't the problem. They were criminals. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling slightly, and I continued to listen as my parents discussed their plan in greater detail. They talked about timing. They talked about Dr. Albright's willingness to cooperate. He was an old college friend of my father's, and my father had been funneling money to his clinic through a political action committee. They talked about making sure I signed the necessary documents while still in the hospital, before I had time to think clearly about what I was signing. They talked about stealing my future as casually as other people might discuss dinner plans. When they left the room an hour later, I stayed perfectly still, playing the part of the exhausted, recovering daughter. But my mind was already 3 moves ahead, already calculating, already planning. They had given me the tools to destroy them. Now I just had to decide whether I was brave enough to use them. Victoria came back alone the next afternoon. She carried a vase of expensive, scentless white lilies, her favorite flowers, the ones she always had delivered to the house, the ones that filled the mansion with nothing but the smell of money and emptiness. She set the vase on the windowsill and pulled a chair close to my bed, arranging herself in the posture of a concerned mother. I sent you a text yesterday, sweetie, she said, her voice carefully modulated to convey concern mixed with just the right amount of contrition. I was stressed about the hospital bills and some family matters. I was worried about you, and sometimes worry makes me say things that aren't appropriate. I was hoping you might delete it. It was inappropriate, and I wouldn't want it to be misunderstood by anyone who might see your phone. She was asking me to destroy evidence. She was asking me to protect her. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw her for perhaps the first time in my life. Not as a mother, not as the architect of my careful conditioning, but as a woman who was afraid. A woman who had miscalculated. A woman who believed that her daughter, frightened and medicated and dependent, would still obey her. What text, Mom? I asked, my voice weak and confused, exactly as she wanted to hear it. I don't remember. The relief that flooded her face was immediate and palpable. Her shoulders relaxed. She smiled, a real smile this time, not a performance. She believed me. She believed that I was too foggy, too traumatized, too broken to hold onto the evidence of her cruelty. "Oh, darling, it doesn't matter," she said, reaching over and patting my hand. "I'm just so glad you're recovering. We're all going to get through this together. Our family is stronger than any crisis." After she left, I took the recording out of my hiding place, backed up to 3 separate secure accounts that she would never know about, and listened to it again. Every word. Every calculated phrase. Every moment of her discussing how to destroy my future was now preserved forever in perfect digital clarity. I was discharged 2 weeks later, not to my own apartment as I had hoped, but to my parents' sprawling estate, a house that had always felt more like a carefully constructed stage set than a home. The discharge papers stated that I needed close family supervision and outpatient psychiatric care, a condition my father had somehow arranged despite my protests. My apartment, the one I had lived in for the past year, the one that represented my fragile attempt at independence, would be waiting for me. Or so I thought. Within 3 days, Victoria had arranged for movers to go through my apartment and clear out everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. She told me it was to reduce my stress, to ensure I didn't have to worry about anything while I recovered. What she actually did was eliminate any escape route I might have considered. I was under constant watch in the gilded prison of my childhood home. Victoria's treatment of me shifted with my discharge. The distant neglect transformed into suffocating control. She dictated what I wore, soft, unthreatening colors, nothing that suggested agency or strength. She monitored what I ate, ensuring I was eating healthy, grounding foods, while making subtle comments about my weight. She controlled my schedule, my therapist appointments, all with Dr. Albright of course, and my social interactions. The mask of concern never slipped. She was always the worried, attentive mother. She was always doing this for my own good. She was always reminding me how lucky I was to have her care during this difficult time. The pity I felt for my former self, the girl who had believed her mother loved her, was overwhelming. On the 7th day of my imprisonment in that house, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't spend the next 3 months until my birthday, 3 months until the trust fund matured and became legally mine, under her watch, playing the role of the fragile, recovering daughter. I needed to move faster. That evening, while my parents were out at a fundraising dinner for one of my father's political allies, I made my move. I had been pretending to rest, but the moment I heard the car pull out of the driveway, I left my room. The study was on the 2nd floor, a room decorated in the masculine aesthetic that my father favored, dark wood, leather, impressive but cold. His mahogany desk was positioned to face the door, a power play I had observed countless times during his political phone calls. The desk was locked. I didn't panic. I had watched my father open this desk 100 times over the years. I had observed his rituals, the way he moved his fingers in a specific sequence. He was a man ruled by narcissism, which meant his security measures were based on personal significance rather than randomness. I tried his birth year. Nothing. I tried the year he first won elected office. Nothing. On the 3rd try, I used the year of his wedding anniversary with my mother, the date that had always seemed to matter more to him than anything else, a date he mentioned at least twice a year. The drawer clicked open. My hands shook as I lifted the documents out. The trust indenture was thick, dense with legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. But I had taken business courses in college. I had studied contract law out of pure self-defense, wanting to understand the one thing in my life that was supposed to be mine. As I read, my fears solidified into certainties. The trust stated clearly that if the beneficiary, me, was proven to be incapacitated, criminally negligent, or institutionalized against her will before reaching age 24, the entire fund would be liquidated immediately and transferred to the secondary beneficiary, my father's political foundation. This was the escape hatch my parents had been counting on. This was their solution to my father's mounting gambling debts and the political scandal that was apparently threatening his career. This was how they had decided to handle the problem of me. I took detailed photographs of the key clauses, making sure the timestamps were embedded in the metadata. Each photo was timestamped, dated, and coded with location data. Then, with surgical precision, I replaced the documents exactly as I had found them and locked the desk. I was no longer a victim in need of rescue. I was a researcher, meticulously gathering evidence for a trial that only I knew was coming. 3 days later, my sister Celeste arrived for a weekend visit. To the outside world, Celeste was everything my parents had wanted me to be: beautiful, accomplished, confident. She had graduated summa cum laude from an Ivy League school. She was engaged to a man from a prominent family. She worked in non-profit administration and gave speeches at charity galas. She was, in every measurable way, the successful daughter. But I had always known that her perfection was a performance, just as my brokenness was one. The first evening she was home, she seemed anxious. She moved through the house with the kind of nervous energy that comes from living under constant evaluation. Her laugh was bright but brittle. Her smiles came a half-second too late, as though she had to calculate whether smiling was the appropriate response. The next afternoon, my mother was downstairs hosting a political donor, a wealthy businessman who had connections my father needed for his upcoming re-election campaign. I could hear Victoria downstairs, singing Celeste's praises loudly enough to ensure the donor heard her, talking about Celeste's accomplishments, her intelligence, her beauty, her perfect engagement. I was in my room pretending to rest, when Celeste slipped in and closed the door quietly behind her. "Ilara," she said, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "We need to talk." I sat up, watching her. My sister was still in her performance mode, still trying to maintain the facade, but underneath it, I could see cracks. Real cracks. Not the carefully constructed ones of a person acting, but the genuine fractures of someone who had been under pressure for so long that she was beginning to break. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. "You have to be careful," she said, lowering her voice even though we were alone. "Mom is absolutely terrified about the trust fund. She's told me," Celeste paused, glancing at the door as though to make sure no one was listening. "She's told me that if you access that money, if you take what's supposed to be yours, Dad's entire career is finished. He's in debt, Ilara. Deep debt. Gambling mostly, but also some investments that went very wrong. He needed that money." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "How deep?" I asked. "Millions," Celeste whispered. "And there's something else. There's a scandal. Something from his past. I don't fully understand it, but it's bad enough that losing the trust fund would expose it. That's why Mom is so focused on your situation right now." Celeste was genuinely scared. Not for herself, though she should have been. Scared for me. Scared of what our parents were capable of. "Celeste," I said carefully, "why are you telling me this?" "Because I love you," she said, and the tears came suddenly, unexpectedly. "And I don't know what they're planning, but I know it's bad. I know it involves Dr. Albright. I know that Mom has been talking to lawyers about conservatorship and trusts and all sorts of legal things that are way beyond what should be happening to someone who's just recovered from an allergic reaction. I know they're planning something, and I'm afraid you don't see it." What she didn't know was that I saw everything. I had seen all of it. But I nodded slowly, acting confused, acting frightened, playing the role of the naive daughter who was just beginning to understand the depths of her parents' betrayal. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. Celeste hugged me before she left, and in that hug, I felt the weight of her own pain. My sister had been perfect, and it had destroyed her. She was terrified, and the terror came from a lifetime of knowing that her value was conditional on her performance. After she left, I thought about what to do with this information. I could use it. I could add it to my collection of evidence. But I needed something more concrete. I needed proof of Celeste's own complicity, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because it would show that my parents' corruption was systemic, not just directed at me. I needed the insurance policy that would force them to cooperate. 2 days after Celeste left, I asked my mother if I could visit my apartment to collect some books and personal items I had left behind. Victoria hesitated, clearly reluctant to let me out of her sight. But she had also been subtly suggesting that I needed to regain my independence, that staying in the house all day was unhealthy, that a carefully supervised trip to my apartment might be part of my recovery. So on a Tuesday afternoon, with my father's driver waiting in the car, I was allowed to visit the place that had represented my freedom. The apartment was bare. Victoria had been efficient. Most of my furniture was gone, most of my clothes were gone. It looked like the apartment of someone who no longer existed. But I moved through it anyway, checking the closets, checking the drawers, playing the role of the nostalgic daughter retrieving memories. In the hall closet, in a box of winter clothes I hadn't touched in months, I found it. An old smartphone from 3 years ago, one I had replaced and then forgotten about. It was dusty, the battery completely drained, but as I held it, something in my chest shifted. I took it with me. That evening, while my mother was on a conference call with a political consultant, I charged the old phone in my room with a charger I found in a drawer. It was slow to boot up, and for several minutes, I thought it might be too damaged to work. But it flickered to life. The screen was cracked, the battery indicator showed only 30% charge, but it was functional. I navigated through the old apps, through the photos I hadn't seen in years, through the digital detritus of a younger version of myself. And then I found it. In the old voice recording app, I found a file labeled MOM Rant. Time-stamped 9 months ago, when Celeste had been visiting, when my mother had been particularly harsh about something I couldn't remember. My heart pounded. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. If anyone heard it, if anyone discovered what was on that recording, everything would change. I deleted the file from the phone's storage to ensure no one could accidentally find it, but before I did, I backed it up to my secure cloud account. Only then did I listen to it. That night, alone in my room with headphones, I played the audio file and heard my sister's voice, broken, terrified, sobbing. She told me if I don't use my savings to cover the campaign shortfall, she'll expose my miscarriage to the whole family, Celeste was saying to someone. Her fiancé, I realized. She's making me sign a non-disclosure agreement. She says Alara is the only thing standing between Dad and jail. She says if Alara gets the trust, if she actually has access to millions of dollars, it will fund investigations into Dad's past, and everything will fall apart. The recording went on, Celeste explaining the situation more fully, explaining the blackmail, explaining that Victoria had threatened to tell everyone in their circle about Celeste's miscarriage if she didn't cooperate. The miscarriage was something Celeste had wanted to keep private, something she was grieving. My mother had weaponized her daughter's pain. I don't know what to do, Celeste sobbed into the phone. I don't know how to fight her. She always wins. The recording cut off. I sat in the darkness of my room, the headphones still in my ears, and I understood finally what my parents had done. They hadn't just created my instability, they had created instability in everyone around them. They hadn't just targeted me, they had victimized everyone in their orbit. Celeste wasn't complicit. Celeste was trapped, just as I was trapped. But unlike Celeste, I had evidence. I immediately backed up Celeste's confession to my secure cloud account, along with the death wish text, the trust indenture photos, and the recording of my parents discussing Dr. Albright. I created a folder called The Truth, and organized every piece of evidence chronologically, with detailed notes about when and where each piece had been collected. I had all the pieces now, the motive, the method, the decades-long pattern of abuse, and the proof that this conspiracy extended to everyone in my family. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to deploy it. The commitment hearing was set for Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks before my 24th birthday. In those 2 weeks, I performed the role of my lifetime. I was fragile. I was confused. I was emotionally unstable. I attended therapy sessions with Dr. Albright, where I carefully confirmed every assumption he made about my psychological state, never quite denying his suggestions but never quite confirming them either. I allowed him to increase my medication. I went through the motions of a daughter breaking down under pressure. My parents watched me with satisfaction, believing that their plan was working perfectly. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in a soft blue dress, the color of innocence, of vulnerability, of a daughter in need of protection. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who appeared fragile and frightened. It was a masterclass in performance. The courtroom was cold and formal, all marble and wood paneling designed to instill authority and fear. My parents sat beside their lawyer, both of them looking gravely concerned. Senator Vance wore his serious expression, the one he used for legislative sessions and tragedy. Victoria wore calculated sadness, like an actress who had studied the role of worried mother for years. Dr. Albright testified first, speaking in his soft voice about my delusions of persecution, my inability to function independently, my pattern of concerning behavior, and my clear need for psychiatric intervention and custodial oversight. He was meticulous in his testimony, painting a portrait of a young woman completely incapable of managing her own affairs. The judge listened carefully, taking notes, his expression sympathetic and grave. Then came the closing arguments from the lawyer my parents had provided for me, a woman whose loyalty clearly rested with whoever was paying her, which was my parents. And then came my turn. I stood slowly, as though the act of standing took significant effort. I moved to the witness stand with careful, measured steps. I sat down and took a breath, and in that moment, I made a decision that would alter the trajectory of my entire existence. I looked at the judge and said the words I had been planning to say for weeks. Your Honor, I have no argument with Dr. Albright's diagnosis, given my family history of mental health challenges. But I would like to submit 3 pieces of evidence that might explain why I might suffer from paranoia or emotional instability. The judge's expression shifted slightly, a hint of surprise. I would like to submit these materials to the court and ask that they be considered as context for my psychological state. I handed a small flash drive to the court clerk. The courtroom went quiet. The court's IT technician reviewed the files quickly, then displayed them on the large screen positioned at the front of the courtroom. First, the text from my mother appeared on the screen, white text on black background, impossible to misinterpret. It's expensive keeping you alive. Honestly, the world, and our family's reputation, would be cleaner if you just disappeared. It would solve everything. The courtroom gasped. Victoria's face went white. The careful mask of concern shattered. For just a moment, I saw the real her, the cold, calculating woman who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. The judge leaned forward, his expression shifting from sympathetic to something far more serious. Next, I said quietly, I would like the court to hear a recording my parents made while I was still in the hospital. The audio played through the courtroom speakers, crystal clear, every word perfectly audible. We need her to stabilize long enough to sign those forms, Victoria. Her 24th birthday is only 3 months away. Once the trust matures on her birthday, we lose everything to her. I know, Charles. That's why I've been cultivating her instability. Dr. Albright has already drafted the commitment recommendation. We claim emotional distress due to the recent trauma. We get the court to appoint us as custodians of the trust, declaring her incapable of managing her assets. Charles dropped his head into his hands. The lawyer stood up, but the judge held up his hand, silencing her. Let her finish, the judge said quietly. Finally, I said, my voice steady now, no longer fragile, no longer playing a role. I would like to submit an audio recording of my sister's testimony. This recording was made 9 months ago. It provides additional context for the systematic pattern of coercion that extends beyond my situation. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Celeste's voice filled the room. Her sobs, her explanation of the blackmail, her description of being forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, her terror at her mother's control. When the recording ended, I sat back and looked at the judge. I understand that my situation might cause concern, I said calmly. But I would submit that my anxiety comes not from a chemical imbalance or a character flaw, but from living in an environment of systematic psychological abuse designed to make me appear unstable. I would suggest that the evidence speaks for itself regarding my parents' true motivations. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at my parents, then at me, then back at the evidence on the screen. I'm going to need to call a brief recess, he said quietly. And I'm going to need to see both Senator and Mrs. Vance in my chambers immediately. The hearing reconvened 40 minutes later. The judge's expression was grave, almost angry. My parents were no longer sitting together. Victoria looked like someone who had been physically struck. My father looked like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. I am dismissing the commitment petition immediately, the judge announced. Not only is there no evidence of incapacity or instability on the part of Ms. Alara Vance, but there is clear evidence of deliberate conspiracy to commit fraud and coercive control against a vulnerable person. He turned to face my parents directly. I am ordering a full investigation into the relationship between Senator Charles Vance and Dr. William Albright, with particular focus on potential conflicts of interest and fraud. I am also ordering an audit of the trust fund and all transactions related to it. The court is appointing an independent financial advisor to manage the trust fund until such time as Ms. Elara Vance reaches her 24th birthday, at which point it becomes hers in full. Additionally, I am issuing a restraining order preventing both Senator and Mrs. Vance from attempting any further contact with Ms. Vance without her explicit consent. He looked at me directly. Ms. Vance, you have demonstrated remarkable courage and intelligence in gathering evidence of this conspiracy. I would strongly recommend that you consider filing additional civil charges and potentially criminal charges as well. The conduct described here crosses every ethical, legal, and moral boundary I have encountered in my 23 years on the bench. The courtroom erupted. My father's lawyer was already on his feet, trying to object, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. But the judge had already stood up and exited the bench, leaving no room for argument. I stayed seated, watching my parents, watching their world collapse in real time. Within hours, the story had leaked to the local news. By evening, it had become a regional scandal. A state senator and his wife, accused of conspiring to defraud their own daughter. A psychiatrist with questionable professional practices. A trust fund worth millions. The details were too salacious, too dramatic, too perfectly structured to be anything but genuine. By the next morning, the story had gone national. 3 weeks later, I sat in the office of a civil rights attorney named Margaret Chen, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of intensity that comes from spending decades fighting for people who had been betrayed by the systems that were supposed to protect them. We can file charges on multiple fronts, Margaret explained, sliding documents across her desk. Attempted fraud, conspiracy, elder coercion. Though you're technically not elderly, the statutes apply. We can also pursue civil cases for emotional distress, defamation. He'll want to argue that you damaged his reputation, but his reputation was damaged by his own conduct, and breach of fiduciary duty. How long will this take? I asked. Years, probably, Margaret said honestly. The criminal cases will take the longest. But I want you to understand something, Elara. You've already won the most important battle. You have your freedom. You have your trust fund, protected and managed independently. You have documentation of everything they did to you. What comes next is justice, but you've already secured your own life. She was right. The day after I turned 24, the trust fund was transferred to my independent financial advisor. $5 million became legally, irrevocably mine. My grandmother's gift, her love expressed through money, was finally within my grasp. I used the first of it to buy a small house. Nothing like the mansion I had grown up in, nothing cold or carefully staged. It was a modest Victorian with natural light and a garden that needed work. It was mine. My sister didn't reach out for 2 months after the hearing. When she finally did, it was by email, carefully worded, as though she was still afraid of saying the wrong thing, of disappointing someone. Elara, I don't know if you'll respond to this, but I needed to try. I wanted to apologize for everything. I know that's not enough. I know I should have spoken up before, should have told you what was happening instead of letting Mom blackmail me into silence. I'm seeing a therapist now, a real one, not Dr. Albright, and she's helping me understand how much damage growing up the way we did has done to me. I ended my engagement. I told my fiancé everything that happened, and he was furious, not at me but at what our family was doing to me, to us. I also turned over everything I know about Dad's gambling debts and Mom's various financial schemes to the investigators. I know that doesn't make me a hero. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to stop being complicit. I'm trying to become someone I can actually respect. I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if I can forgive myself. But I wanted you to know that you inspired me to finally say no to them. Celeste. I read the email 3 times. Then I drove to the therapist's office where Celeste was waiting, and I hugged my sister for the first time in years. Not the performative hugs we had exchanged at family events, but a real embrace from one wounded person to another. I don't expect you to forgive them, I told her. But I hope you'll forgive yourself. You were a victim too. We all were. I should have been stronger, Celeste said. No, I replied. You should have been kinder to yourself. We both should have been. The criminal trial lasted 4 months. My mother was convicted on 3 counts of conspiracy, 2 counts of attempted fraud, and 1 count of coercive control. She was sentenced to 6 years in a minimum security facility. My father was convicted on 5 counts of conspiracy, 2 counts of fraud, and additional charges related to money laundering and financial crimes connected to his political position. His sentence was 12 years. Dr. Albright lost his license and faced charges of fraud and professional misconduct. He took a plea deal that resulted in probation and mandatory community service, a punishment that felt inadequate for the complicity of his actions. I testified in the trial, speaking calmly and clearly about what I had experienced, about the years of calculated emotional abuse, about the moment in the hospital when my mother's true intentions were revealed. The prosecutor asked careful questions designed to establish the narrative of systematic abuse. My parents' lawyer tried to discredit me, tried to suggest that I was exaggerating, that my interpretation of events was colored by my own mental health challenges. I simply answered truthfully, showed the evidence, and let the facts speak for themselves. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. 6 months after the trial concluded, I was invited to speak at a conference on family systems, abuse, and recovery. The organizers wanted me to share my story, to help other people who might be in similar situations understand what they were experiencing and how they might protect themselves. I was terrified. But I also knew that this was important. On a Saturday morning in November, in a hotel ballroom in front of 200 people, I stood at a podium and told my story. Not as a victim speaking to earn sympathy, but as a survivor speaking to create understanding. I talked about the subtle nature of psychological abuse, about how it often hides behind concern and love. I talked about the ways that systems, family systems, financial systems, psychiatric systems, can be manipulated to control people. I talked about the importance of documentation, of trusting your instincts, and of recognizing that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who are most likely to betray you. And I talked about recovery. Recovery isn't about forgiving the people who hurt you, I said, looking out at the audience. Recovery is about building a life that is so full of joy, so rich with possibility, that their cruelty becomes a footnote instead of the main story. Recovery is about reclaiming your power, not by seeking revenge, but by building something better than they ever tried to destroy. When I finished, the audience applauded. Afterward, a young woman approached me, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you," she said simply. "My mother does things like that to me, nothing as dramatic maybe, but the same psychological games. I didn't have words for what was happening until I heard you describe it. Now I know I'm not crazy. I know this isn't my fault." That conversation, more than any legal victory, felt like victory. On my 25th birthday, I sat in Margaret Chen's office and reviewed the final settlement of the civil case against my parents. They had been ordered to pay me an additional $2 million in damages for emotional distress and defamation. They didn't have that money. Not anymore. Their assets had been seized, their reputations destroyed, their ability to earn income severely compromised by their criminal convictions and the legal fees associated with their trials. So I would receive payments over the next 10 years, small amounts extracted from their reduced circumstances, a constant financial reminder of what they had done. I didn't want the money. "What if," I said to Margaret, "we donated it to a fund for victims of family abuse? Particularly younger victims who might need legal support or therapeutic services?" Margaret smiled. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." We established the Victoria and Charles Vance Fund for Victims of Family Abuse, named after my parents, ensuring that their legacy would not be their cruelty, but the help they were forced to provide to others they had hurt. It was the perfect irony, and it was my choice. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from my father. He was in prison, in a minimum security facility where he was allowed limited communication privileges. The letter had been screened by prison officials, carefully reviewed to ensure it contained nothing threatening or inappropriate. "Ilara," it began, "I don't expect you to respond to this. I don't deserve a response. But I needed to tell you something, and I don't know when or if I'll have another opportunity to say it. I was wrong. Profoundly, irredeemably wrong. What your mother and I did to you, what I allowed your mother to do to you, was one of the greatest failures of my life. I tell myself that I was trying to protect my career, trying to solve our financial problems, trying to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that was spiraling beyond my ability to manage. But the truth is much simpler and much more damning. I was a coward. I was selfish. I chose myself, and my reputation, over my own child. I don't ask for your forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did. I understand that the consequences I'm facing are appropriate. I understand that you owed me nothing, and yet you chose to live your life, to build something meaningful, instead of being destroyed by what we did to you. That speaks to your character, not mine. I am not the same man who entered that courtroom 2 years ago. Whether that is enough to matter, I suppose, is not for me to decide. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in a drawer, not to throw away, but not to dwell on either. My father's redemption, or lack thereof, was no longer my responsibility. I had spent enough of my life taking responsibility for other people's choices, other people's emotions, other people's failures. What mattered now was my own life. My own choices. My own future. 3 years after the trial, I stood in front of my childhood home, the mansion that had been seized by the state as part of the criminal proceedings and sold at auction. It was being prepared for demolition, the new owners having purchased the land for its prime location, planning to build something new in its place. I had asked for permission to walk through one last time before the bulldozers arrived. The rooms were empty now, the furniture sold, the paintings removed, the cold aesthetics stripped away. What remained was just a structure. Expensive, yes, but empty of meaning, empty of memory, empty of the power it had once held over me. I walked through the kitchen where my mother had made pointed comments about my eating habits. I walked through the formal dining room where we had sat in careful silence, the only sound the clink of expensive silverware against expensive china. I walked up the stairs to the study where I had cracked open my father's desk and found the evidence that would set me free. And I felt nothing. That was the most powerful moment of all. The realization that this place, which had seemed so important, which had seemed so powerful, which had shaped so much of who I was just a building. The power it had held over me had come from me, had been granted by me, had been maintained by my belief in the legitimacy of the control that was being exerted over me. Once I stopped believing, the building became just a building. I walked back to my car, locked the gate behind me, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't feel nostalgia or regret. I felt free. I am now 27 years old. I have published a book about my experiences, a memoir that has been adapted into a limited series for streaming television. The proceeds from both the book and the series have gone primarily to the Vance Fund, which now operates in 15 states and has helped over 300 people escape abusive family situations. I have completed my degree in psychology, specializing in family trauma and systemic abuse. I am now working toward my doctorate, planning to spend my career helping people understand the ways that psychological abuse works, how to recognize it, and how to protect themselves. My sister Celeste and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual understanding and genuine compassion. She has also become involved in trauma awareness work, speaking about the specific ways that family systems can harm even the golden children who appear to have everything. My mother is serving her sentence quietly. My father has 5 years remaining on his sentence. Neither has reached out to me since his first letter, and I have not responded to his communication. I live in my Victorian house with a garden that is now flourishing, filled with flowers and vegetables and the kind of natural beauty that cannot be controlled or perfected. I have friends who genuinely care about me, a therapist who helps me process my experiences, and a life that is fundamentally, authentically, completely my own. There are still difficult moments. There are still nights when I have dreams about that hospital room, about the beeping of the monitors, about reading those words that revealed my mother's true nature. There are still moments when someone says something that echoes patterns I recognize from my family, and my nervous system goes on high alert. But those moments are no longer the main story of my life. They have become chapters in a much larger narrative, a narrative about resilience, about the power of evidence, about the possibility of rebuilding yourself even when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally have done everything in their power to destroy you. I sometimes think about that girl in the hospital bed, reading the text message with trembling fingers, not yet understanding the full scope of her parents' betrayal. If I could go back to that moment, I would tell her, "You are going to survive this. You are going to be more than a survivor. You are going to be an advocate, a voice, a force for change. You are going to build a life so beautiful, so meaningful, so authentically yours that their cruelty will seem like a small shadow in comparison to the light you create. But I don't think I would need to tell her that. I think she already knows. I think she already suspects, in that moment of crisis, that she is stronger than she has been allowed to believe. And I think that is enough. If you've made it this far, you understand, respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by my mother's text wishing I'd disappear, or by Dr. Albright's false diagnosis. My story proves that silence can be a weapon, and patience, saving those vital recordings, can be absolute power. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who's been gaslit into invisibility. Tell them, your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. My screen recording wasn't petty revenge, it was the evidence that saved my life. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. They thought they'd institutionalize me for the trust fund. I used their own corruption to free myself. Share your story below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.